Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to part 3 of our three-part discussion of the works of Joseph Beuys. And in this discussion, what I want to look at is his post-Dusseldorf period. Beuys left Dusseldorf in a bit of a scandal in 1972 when he had a disagreement with the people who were in charge there about enrolling the students. He was taking in a bunch of students and letting them enroll without satisfying certain requirements. Beuys had this very large sort of democratic idea that anyone could be an artist and that everyone was an artist in some way. And his classes were conducted, there was a certain atmosphere of anarchy in the classroom that turned off a number of his friends, such as the artist Georg Immendorf, for instance. And they weren't interested in that sort of approach. And it caused a scandal, and basically he had to resign. And so he left the Kunstakademie in 1972. The last of his actions, as we have seen, was in 1974 when he did the Coyote action, and so the third period of his works of art extend from about 1974 down to about 1985 or 86. He died in 1986. And so what we want to look at here are a few of the works from that final period. Now, there is a tendency in this period toward monumentalization. The works get larger and larger, and one of the problems, I think, with Beuys period 3 is that there's a loss of tension between the evolutionary aspect of his works and the entropic aspect. We had seen that the great period of his work, the floraison of it, the middle period, functioned precisely because of this tension between the opposite polar tendencies of evolution on the one hand, which was tended to be represented with his fat objects, such as the fat chair, and the various copper usages of copper for conducting electricity on the other, as opposed to the entropic tendencies represented by his uses of felt. Here we have a work that typifies the use of felt. This is Snowfall from 1965 that shows the felt here is a stand-in for snow, and both snow and the felt are suffocating these three branches that are like three shoots that are representing the rebirth of new life after the suffocation of the felt insulating principle. And so felt always has this sense of suffocation, isolation, communication breakdown, and so forth. But the problem with the third period is that the felt begins to be absorbed by the evolutionary objects, such as the great batteries. This is Fond number 4 from 1970. Fond, I suppose, as in foundation, fundament. And these batteries he saw as batteries for social change and transformation by conducting spiritual potentiality. And they were made out of copper sheets. The copper conducts the electricity, interleaved and interfiled with sheets of felt. And so in the later period, the evolutionary works begin to digest and dissolve the entropic works. They actually gobble them up. And so in the third period, we see fewer and fewer, and eventually almost not at all, we see the entropic objects. They begin to disappear from the art. And I think the disappearance of the entropic objects, with few exceptions, began to cause the art to lose the brilliance of its tension. And to make up for that lack of tension, the art began to monumentalize and get larger and larger in order to make any sort of an impression at all. Here's a larger version of the batteries, Fond number 8 from 1985. And here we see the battery, which represents a sort of catalyst or conduit for social change and transformation, achieving a monumental scale, but it's completely engulfed the felt, the principle of entropy and communication breakdown. Tallow is another work from this period, 1977. Tallow was made from, a mold was taken from a freeway overpass in the city of Munster, and the mold was filled in as though he were extracting a tooth to reveal its decay. The mold was filled in with fat and was created on a gigantic scale in order to illustrate the kinds of concrete, the kinds of blighting of our cities with the use of concrete and architecture. And by extracting the tooth, symbolically extracting the overpass and representing it in the form of fat, it reveals the decay of the sort of enframing aspect of our contemporary cities. But this was merely, I think, just a gigantification of the principle of his earlier fat corners. Here's one of them here from 1963, where he would put fat in corners in order to neutralize the right angularity, the masculinist, scientific, dominating right angularity of a room by neutralizing it by putting fat in the corners and rounding out the corners and conferring upon them a feminine curvilinear valency that opened up new spiritual possibilities other than the right angularity of masculine scientific thinking. And I think that the tallow is simply a monumentalization of these fat corners. It's making exactly the same point. One of the few entropic objects from this period is the installation here known as Plight in 1985, in which there are several rooms, and there's a piano put in them, and the rooms are lined and insulated with rolls of felt, so that the piano, when it emits sound, the sound emitted by the piano is immediately absorbed by the felt, and so it's neutralized and rendered totally ineffective. And again, all we have here is simply a large-scale version of his famous felt pianos that we had seen earlier. It makes exactly the same point, except on a larger scale. Honey Pump at the Workplace is another work here from 1977. This is simply a monumental version of horns, which we had seen in the previous discussion. The horns illustrated the flow of the blood through the animal that produced the horns on an annual basis. Here, the honey pump that is put in, it was installed in the staircase of a museum, and there was a series of tubes with honey standing in for blood, meant to represent the human body, and the honey as stand-in for blood was meant to represent the circulation of the blood through the human body on a kind of a monumental scale, and this was in 1977. So it's simply a larger version of horns, the earlier horns from 1961, I think it was. So the work is monumentalizing in this period, and it's sort of making the same points that he made in his earlier career. And also, this is one of his last works. This is the end of the 20th century from 1985, which is a series of basalt blocks that are laid down in an installation on the floor of the museum. But it also indicates the complete victory of the mineralogical principle. Rudolf Steiner had written about the mineralogical principle as the stiffening principle that our bodies are always working against. There's a spiritual principle that works, and it's linked with the principle of warmth, that is always working against the stiffening principle, and as we age, the stiffening mineralogical principle gains ground over the human body, and it gets stiffer and stiffer, and so the body loses out the battle. Same thing, I think, in Beuy's work. Ironically, the mineralogical principle stiffens up, and his work gets stiffer over time, and it begins to lose contact with the central warming aspect of the human being that he had spoken of in drawing inspiration from the works of Rudolf Steiner. And he ended up with the complete victory of the mineralogical principle here, I think, in this, appropriately enough, in this installation from 1985. This did have an influence on Anish Kapoor, though. This is Anish Kapoor's work, Void Field, from 1989, which picks up directly from Beuys here. Kapoor does, we'll get to Kapoor, but he does an interesting thing here where he drills these little holes on the insides to give a kind of depth, a kind of interior to each one of these basalt blocks. Kapoor is up to something different than what Beuys was up to, but we'll see how that works later on. And so that wraps up our discussion of Joseph Beuys. We've seen his career evolve in the three phases of the pre-Dusseldorf period, the Dusseldorf period, and the post-Dusseldorf period. And we have seen how his work evolved from the first period when he was dealing with the human body itself as the primary cosmological surface of inscription upon which he was inscribing all of his signifiers, almost like a tattoo artist putting tattoos on the body. He was inscribing them on the surface of the human form. And the human form's connection with cosmic cycles and the becoming's animal in the cosmos. And then in the second period of his art, what I termed cosmology B, the human tended to begin to disappear from his works of art, and impersonal cosmic forces, Steinerian cosmic forces such as the principle of evolution, spiritual evolution, and the warming principle began to come in and to absorb and dismantle the human body and the human form. And we saw that his art in the middle period became an art of traces. The bathtub and the record and the felt piano, these were all traces that had survived from the wreckage and ruin of a previous world, and they were re-territorialized by the artist to perform strange new functions to illustrate communication breakdown. And in this middle period, we saw how the entropic forces were working against the evolutionary forces, and that created the central tension of his work that made it such a success. And then in the third period, the evolutionary works, like the batteries, tended to gobble up the entropic works, so that the entropic objects tended to disappear, not entirely as we've seen with Plight of 1985, but they tended to disappear from the third period, and the work lost most of its tension as a result, and it just became based on monumentalizing earlier works, which is a sort of typical late period of an artist. It also happens to civilizations when they wind down into their end phases. they become obsessed with making larger and larger and larger monuments to impress the masses and to make up for the lack of inspiration in the work. And so that's the unfolding of the work of Joseph Beuys.